The era of the 1920s sees three Republican presidents: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. These three men guide and steer the nation on the roller coaster that is the 1920s, showing heights of great prosperity, some of the greatest prosperity in our nation's history, all the way to the lowest of the lowest depressions in our nation's history as well. They kind of retreat from the idea of progressivism that we saw under Republican presidents like President Theodore Roosevelt, and they believe that they can serve the public good better through less action. All right? It is also an era that shows a great deal of corruptness and corruption within the government, particularly during Harding's administration. And, Harding himself was an easygoing guy, warm-handed, he's kind of a backslapper, like just one of the guys, happy to be around. Not overly intelligent, but not dumb either. Mediocre in thought. Like previous administrations before him that had great corruption, like Ulysses S. Grant, unable to detect bad morality in others. Doesn't have a good morality radar. So he himself, being an Ohio man, surrounds himself with other Ohio men, and they collectively become known as the Ohio Gang, even though you don't have to be from Ohio to be part of it. But that's just kind of what they were called. So he promised, he even admits, he's like, I'm not that smart, so I'm going to surround myself with smart people. And he does that to some extent. He gets this guy named Charles Evans Hughes, and he's going to be our Secretary of State, he is brilliant, and his belief is very conservative and isolationistic, and he accomplishes that. Like we don't really help Europe much at all. We just kind of butt out after World War I. Secretary of Treasury, he appoints a Pittsburgh aluminum multi-millionaire named Andrew Mellon. You may have heard of his last name, Mellon, like Carnegie Mellon, named after him. Herbert Hoover, he appoints him to be, he was the wartime food administrator. If you remember during World War I, there was the food rationing. It was Herbert Hoover. So now Herbert Hoover is going to be the Secretary of Commerce. And these are all brilliant, good, hardworking people. But the best minds were largely offset by some of the worst, like Senator Albert B. Fall, who was he was a senator from New Mexico, who was a scheming anti-conservationist. And he was appointed to be Secretary of the Interior. You guys know that's still a department. You guys know what the Secretary of Interior does? They handle our nation's natural resources. And he's an anti-conservationist. Doesn't sound like a very good job for him. And then another corrupt man he hires is a man by the name of Harry Daugherty. Daugherty. He was a small-town lawyer, but a big-time crook. And as a lawyer, he was appointed to be the Attorney General of the United States. You guys know what the Attorney General does? The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America. Do you think opportunity for corruption abounded with Harry Daugherty? Like, oh no, I'm getting ready to get in trouble. Oh no, there's prohibition. Hey, Harry Daugherty, help me out. Here's some money. Hey, Harry Daugherty, can I get a liquor license? Here's some money. Harry Daugherty, very corrupt. I mean, his job is to prosecute wrongdoers. And when wrongdoers got in trouble, he just took money from them. Now, as far as the entire political party of the day, which is the Republicans, they pretty much dominated the decade in all parts of the government, whether it be legislative branch, executive branch, and judicial branch. It was very much Republican dominated. And this Republican-led administration wanted to use the old doctrine of laissez-faire. What's laissez-faire? It's French. Means what? Yeah, hands off. Hands off. So government's going to keep its hands off. What's it going to keep the government's hands off of? Mainly business. Stay out of business. In fact, they're going to do things to help business, especially on their path to profits. The Supreme Court is a striking example of that trend. Now, Harding dies in office, and he's only president for 3 years. But in his 3-year stint as president, he appoints 4 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. Almost half the justices he appointed. One of them was actually really good for the future, and his name was William Howard Taft. He's a former president of the United States. And he becomes Chief Justice. And he was a really good Chief Justice. Even though he's very, he's a Republican and conservative, he does more for the progressive aspects for the future than the other choices. So, but early on in the 1920s, the Supreme Court axed a lot of progressive legislation, the stuff that the progressives wanted to accomplish. For example, the progressives had a child labor law they were trying to push through. They killed it, so kind of setback for children. It stripped away many of labor's hard-won gains during World War I. For example, there was a case that had happened during the war which would give women special protection in the workplace. Like, that's what it did, like setting a minimum wage for women. Well, they just did away with that because they said that now that women have the right to vote, they have no longer need of special attention. So it's they don't need any special legislation. So as you can see, it just strikes against progressive legislation. And all these things are good for who? Who's it good for that you don't have to pay women as much? Businesses, because they're making more money. They don't have to pay as much. Bad for labor, good for corporations. And corporations under Harding could once more relax and expand. Antitrust laws were often ignored, avoided by circumvention, just avoided, or feebly enforced. They just kind of turned away whenever monopolies found that they existed. In particularly when it was the Attorney General's job to do that. Well, if you found yourself having a monopoly, all you had to do is bribe him, and he would look the other way. So, a lot of problems here, especially if you are not a wealthy person. So, labor definitely felt the crunch of this unfriendly attitude towards them and friendly attitude towards business. And strikes abounded. And very, very, very few were successful as the federal government supported businesses in every strike. Every strike. There was only one other group of people in America that were helped by the federal government that were not businesses, and that was veterans. Veterans actually got some assistance in this time period. Needy veterans are among the few business groups to reap lasting gains in this era. And in 1921, Congress generously created the Veterans Bureau. Well, today it's called the VA. It still exists. Ever heard of it? Veterans Administration. And what the Veterans Bureau does is it's authorized to operate hospitals, provide vocational rehabilitation for disabled veterans. And, there was opposition to it, and so veterans organized together, and they formed pressure groups. The largest pressure group became the American Legion. The American Legion, which was actually founded in 1919 in Paris by Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who's pictured here on the right. He's got the pointing finger. That's Teddy Roosevelt's son. That's Teddy Roosevelt Jr. And he founds the American Legion. And members of the American Legion are called legionnaires. And legionnaires would meet periodically, discuss their old hardships, let off steam and some good-natured horseplay. And it soon became distinguished for its militant patriotism, staunch conservatism, and zealous anti-radicalism. I want to see radicalness. But most importantly, the American Legion became notorious for its aggressive lobbying for veterans' benefits. Help the veterans out. And the chief grievance of these former doughboys was they wanted dough. What kind of dough? What are we talking about? Money. They wanted money. They argued for what they called adjusted compensation. Adjusted compensation. They were like, we were over here in a trench, living in a hole in the ground, when our buddies that got to stay home were working in a factory making money. We want the money. We want lost wages. We feel like we want the money. We want money. So, obviously a lot of conservative within the government kind of saw this as a holdup, but millions of veterans deployed political artillery, if you can imagine that. So what they did is they just kind of kept hounding Congress until Congress was browbeaten into passing a bonus bill in 1922, which Harding actually vetoed. But Congress ultimately overrides him. Took 2 years to override him. But in 1924, the bill that gets passed is called the Adjusted Compensation Act. In 1924. What this is going to do is that it would give every soldier that participated in World War I an insurance policy. And in 20 years, they could cash it in. So, that was passed in 1924. So when could they cash it in? 1944. You're very good at math. So in 20 years, they get money. Just cash. So it kind of shuts them up for a while. It's good because they are getting some money, but they have to live 20 more years to get it. Thank you. So, if you die between then and then, it's not like they can pay it to your family. That's it. So all in all, this was about a $3.5 billion piece of legislation. So the veterans got their loot, and it's meant to be paid out in 1944. You think they make it to 1944? When was it passed? 1924. Does something happen between 1924 and 1944 where people need some money? Yeah. So things come to a head before then, and we'll get to that. Okay. So, we mentioned some of the bad stuff of Harding's administration. One such scandal is called the Teapot Dome scandal. Teapot Dome. Has nothing to do with tea or domes. Teapot Dome is the name of a place. It's in Wyoming. Teapot Dome, Wyoming. All right. Now, Teapot Dome, Wyoming had oil. It was a site that had lots of oil reserves. These oil reserves were designated to belong to the United States Navy so that they could use the oil for ships and make gasoline and fuel for our ships. Okay? Now, Albert B. Fall, who is our nation's Secretary of Interior, he induces the transfer of these valuable properties to the Department of the Interior, his department. Fall then quietly begins to basically give this land away to people like Harry Sinclair, who is an oil man. He owns an oil company. In return for a bribe. And Albert Fall gets close to $500,000 in bribes off of this land. What's this land used for? Supposed to be for? Yeah, so that if our nation needs to go to war, it can have fuel. What's Albert Fall doing? Selling it for personal profit. Sounds like a great guy, huh? Is that against the law? Yeah, big time. Big time. Now, it's called the Teapot Dome scandal because that's what this area of land is called, Teapot Dome. So ultimately, Albert Fall is found out, and after a few years of being resigning, and it ultimately comes to court, and he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to 1 year in jail. 1 year. So this oily smudge of scandal certainly pollutes the prestige of our federal government. Harding had no idea. He didn't know. But, ignorance is not the same as innocence. Just because he didn't know doesn't mean he's not going to face trouble. So, a lot of citizens are thinking that people in our government are selling out our nation's vital resources, especially those that were designated for our Navy, our military. So it kind of undermines the faith in our nation. And this is not the only scandal. We talked about the underhanded doings of Attorney General Harry Daugherty. He was illegally giving out pardons. He has the authority to use the president's name for pardons. Especially people that were bootleggers in violation of the Volstead Act, prohibition. He's also handing out illegal liquor permits. So he was forced to resign. So all these scandals do a lot to tarnish the image of our government. And Warren G. Harding feels responsible. He's not a bad guy. He does feel responsible, and he wants to try to make it right. So he embarks on a speech-making tour across the entire country. He even goes to Alaska. No easy feat. But he goes to Alaska. Giving speeches to try to promote believing in your government again, believing in him. But the trip takes its toll on him. And while on a return trip in San Francisco, he dies of pneumonia and thrombosis. It's a heart attack and pneumonia. And another president dies in office, and Americans everywhere express genuine sorrow, even though most people were not genuinely aware of all the corruption that was existed in his administration. And the brutal fact is that Harding is just simply not a strong enough man for the presidency. As he himself admitted privately, he wasn't strong enough. And his vice president takes over, Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, upon hearing that the president had died, he was visiting his father in Vermont, because that's where he's from. He's from Vermont. And his dad's a justice of the peace, so he's like a judge. His dad swore him in on this family Bible. So that was kind of cool. He is the embodiment of New England virtue, honesty, morality, hard work, and frugality. You know what it means to be frugal? Not willing to spend much money. Calvin Coolidge gets a nickname. You guys know his nickname? Silent Cal. Known for brilliant flashes of silence. He just wouldn't speak. He's silent. And he constantly had a look on his face like he smelled something bad. Look at him. One newspaper reported that he had looks as though he was weaned on a pickle. Weaned on a pickle. So he's painfully shy. Did not really like to talk to people, hence his name. Blessed with only mediocre powers of leadership. If you're shy and you don't want to speak to people, that's probably politics is probably not for you. But when he did speak, he was invariably boring, and he delivered his speaking voice was very nasal and had a thick New England twang. So imagine JFK speaking through his nose. That's kind of what he sounded like. But given that he is still a part of the Republican Party, he wants to continue the idea of the hands-off temperament of government, and he let business do what business wanted to do. But he was a moral guy. He did not allow for any kind of corruption within his administration. If he found out about it, he rooted it out. And he loved to fish. Check him out. Loved to fish. This is a picture of Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge, let me tell you about his day. Like he slept like 12 hours a day, like between nighttime and daytime. And he would go on vacation for like 3 months. Imagine the President of the United States today going on vacation for 3 months. He vacationed more than any other president in American history. One of his vacations brought him to the Black Hills of South Dakota. Now, South Dakota, you guys know anything about South Dakota? Anything at all? Mount Rushmore's there. Was Mount Rushmore there when Calvin Coolidge was there? No. But the state government of South Dakota wanted to build something so that people would be like, I want to go to South Dakota, because they had no reason for anyone to go there. So what they do is they know that Calvin Coolidge is an avid fisherman. So they set him up with a nice cabin next to a river, and then they dam the river up with like nets underwater, and then they stock that river. Like they put nets in one place and the nets in the other, and they stock that river with thousands of fish, so that every cast Calvin Coolidge can't help but catch a fish. You got thousands of starving fish. There's not enough food to support them all. And he's like, wow, this place is amazing. And he stays there for like 3 months. And every night they're just restocking the river with fish so that he can catch all the fish he wants. So we want to make the president happy. And by the end of his visit, they're like, hey, we'd like to build something. Can we get some funding? He's like, yeah, this place is great. What do you want? And they get the funding to build Mount Rushmore. And that's how that happened. Isn't that cool? I think it's cool. All right. So he's president for a while. The third president of the Republican 1920s is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge chooses not to run in 1928, which is this election, the election of 1928. And Herbert Hoover chooses to. He's the Republican nominee. The Democratic nominee was Alfred E. Smith. Alfred E. Smith. 4 times he had been the governor of New York. One of the most colorful personalities in American politics. Wisecracking, glad-handing liberal. But he does suffer from some pretty debilitating political handicaps. First, he's Catholic. Second, he is anti-prohibition. So what would he be, wet or dry? If he's anti-prohibition, he would be wet. And where is his base located? The base of the Democratic Party in 1928. Remember, the Democrats were the party of secession. The South. He's Catholic. He's from New York. And he's anti-prohibition. He's lucky he won that many states in the South. Okay? So, Herbert Hoover was born poor and an orphan. But he worked his way through Stanford University, where he became a mining engineer who traveled abroad. Pretty thin-skinned, didn't handle criticism well. So, these two men face off in the election of 1928 for President of the United States. And, where Al Smith being, a Catholic, a wet, a descendant of Irish grandparents, from a city, all of this was too much. This is a time when the Ku Klux Klan was in fundamental Protestantism was dominating parts of the South. If he wasn't all of those things, he may have had a chance, but all of them were just too much for a lot of people to overcome. So Hoover triumphed in a landslide. He wins 444 to 87. That is a landslide. Not only that, but a huge Republican majority was also returned to the House of Representatives. So now President Hoover is in control of the government, and he wins the election of 1928. When does he become president? You win the election in November of 28. When do you actually become president? January? Yeah, like January or March. Now it's January. At this time it was March.
Don't you have to write all these papers and stuff like that?
Yeah. So now he's president, and he kind of hits the ground running, and he does this thing called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. What's a tariff? Tax on imported goods. Now, this tariff started out in the House as a fairly reasonable protective measure, and it was designed to assist our farmers. Okay? But by the time it got through the House and through the Senate, it had 1,000 amendments. 1,000 amendments. Or changes. And it turned out to be the highest protective tariff in our nation's peacetime history. And the average tax on goods was raised from 38.5% to 60%. Who does this anger? Who has to pay it? Who has to pay it? If it's a tariff, it's a tax on who? It's a tax on imported goods. So who's the one selling it to us? Foreign countries. Foreigners were very angry. They see this as a kind of a blow below, like a blow below the belt. So also, this is at a time when like these nations are destroyed due to World War I. And the United States slips even further into economic isolationism. And all of this is playing right into the hands of radical movements in Europe, particularly into the hands of a demagogue named Adolf Hitler. And we'll talk about the fall of the economy tomorrow.